United States and Iran continue to give conflicting claims of where potential peace talks stand as the war enters its 27th day. Iran is publicly dismissing President Trump's 15-point ceasefire proposal and now offering up its own terms. A diplomatic source stationed in Iran tells MS Now those conditions include war reparations and sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranian foreign minister adding yesterday in an interview on state TV, his government has no plans to negotiate. This defiance is also reflected on the battlefield this morning as Tehran continues to strike across the region. Sirens sounded in Tel Aviv and Bahrain. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait worked to intercept incoming Iranian fire. And authorities in the UAE said 2 people were killed and 3 others wounded by shrapnel from a ballistic missile interception. The White House, meanwhile, is maintaining confidence in reaching a deal. Listen to President Trump just last night.
They are negotiating, by the way, and they want to make a deal so badly, but they're afraid to say it because they figure they'll be killed by their own people. They're also afraid they'll be killed by us. There's never been a head of a country that wanted that job less than being the head of Iran. I don't want it. We listen to some of the things they say. We hear them very clearly. They say, I don't want it. We'd like to make you the next supreme leader. No, thank you. I don't want it. But I thought it would be much worse. I thought that the energy prices, oil price would go up higher. I thought the stock market would go somewhat lower. But it didn't matter to me. It's short term. What we had to do is get rid of the cancer. We had to cut out the cancer. The cancer was Iran with a nuclear weapon. And we've cut it out. Now we're going to finish it off.
Of course, the president is saying there that he was willing to sacrifice in some ways the economic metrics that he's just talking about. And yet his actions have told a different story throughout the weeks of this conflict. That being said, the president is hoping to end the war quickly, according to new reporting from the Wall Street Journal. He's privately informed advisors he thinks the conflict is in its final stages, urging them to stick to the 4 to 6 week timeline he's outlined publicly, according to people familiar with the matter. One idea that Trump has floated to advisors is securing U.S. access to some of Iran's oil as part of any deal to end the war, according to a senior administration official. That official said there isn't any current planning underway for that outcome, though. U.S. officials also told the paper Trump is willing to order troops onto Iranian soil, but is reluctant to do so, in part because it could upend his goal of a speedier end to the conflict. He's also concerned that the number of troops killed or injured in the operation could rise if the war continues. That is, of course, a central concern. Here on set with me, White House reporter for Politico, Megan Messerly, is going to help us get inside the White House on this, because I think that's one of the reasons that people on the Hill, including Republicans who have gotten quite vocal about this in the last 24 hours or so, are getting worried that maybe there is another wave coming of military intervention, potential for troops to be on the ground in Iran or other places around the region. And that is making them nervous. The fact that it comes after a briefing yesterday is, I think, notable, but it's in such stark contrast to the way that the administration and the president are talking about this needing to be a shorter conflict. So where do you see the North Star of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great point, Ali. And when I'm talking to folks close to the White House, the thing I keep hearing time and time again is the president is trying to find an off-ramp here. So there's one school of thought, right, that is we are seeing forces massing near Iran, additional thousands of troops heading that direction, and that is a negotiating tactic. A lot of folks close to the president who were not fans of this war in the first place are hoping that is the direction things are going in. Yeah. At the same time, there are a lot of folks who are really worried, including, as you mentioned, folks on the Hill, who are worried that, you know, if those troops are in the region, the president is going to want to use them. And if there is action on Karg Island, for instance, if there are more extensive U.S. boots on the ground, that risks putting the U.S. into a more protracted conflict, one that you can't get out of in the 4 to 6 week timeframe that the president has been talking about.
That's exactly right. And then, of course, there is this ongoing question of Iran says it's not negotiating. The president is obviously clear that he thinks that they are. They were never doing direct negotiations. No. It was always indirect. And I think those conversations are clearly still happening. So it's probably somewhere in the middle of these two extremes. And yet, when you see reporting moving in the Journal, and I think it's also been pretty common knowledge that this White House doesn't want this to be a protracted, bogged down conflict, the Iranians get a say in that.
They do.
And so I wonder the way that the White House is trying to triangulate around that. They really don't control the entire situation. They control what they control.
Absolutely. And this is something I was talking to folks about at the beginning of the conflict. There was a lot of hope that this would look more like what we saw in Venezuela. Obviously not as quick as that, in and out, the ouster of Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro. At the same time, there were a lot of folks who were hoping that this would be kind of a shorter operation, not even on the 4 to 6 week time frame. We had that Venezuelan operation. We had the strikes on Iran last summer. Yeah. Both of those were relatively targeted, and so the concern going into this is yes, it is going to become more protracted and in a way that's going to make it really hard for the president to get out of.
I also think that the Venezuela operation does seem to loom large in the minds of Republicans close to the White House that I've spoken to, because that operation went well.
Yes.
It was much more clearly defined than this. And even then there were questions about how clearly defined it was,
yes.
right? But it did seem to age well. And I think that looms large in the minds of people who want to give this administration the time, space, and patience to try to figure it out. And yet, it's also coming as new polling shows that the conflict could be a growing political liability for the president and Republicans heading into the midterms. How far does the patience stretch? According to the latest AP NORC poll, 59% of Americans say U.S. military action in Iran has actually gone too far. That number is even higher when you look at independent voters. The poll shows 45% of Americans are extremely or very concerned about being able to afford gas in the coming months. That number was 30% back in December of 2024, shortly after Trump won re-election. Meanwhile, President Trump's foreign policy approval rating now sits at 34%. That's down 2 points from last month. And so when you take all of that together, where do you think it ultimately leads this White House if they can't just get out on the timeline that they established, because that's not Iran's timeline?
Right, exactly. I mean, and that is the big challenge, is how much here does the president care about declaring victory in this war versus getting out and having some sort of, economic cool down that Republicans really want ahead of the midterm elections. And this is the challenge here, I think, to your point. This is something that, the president's allies were saying, it's up to him. He sort of gets to set the terms of victories. One of the benefits of not being explicit about his goals at the very beginning of this is he sort of gets to define what the end and what victory looks like. But at the same time, if Iran is still firing on the Strait, if the Strait of Hormuz is closed, hard for the president to declare victory. And so the question here is, how concerned is the president about the impact of all of that on the midterm elections, on the economy, on his legacy?
But do you buy it when he says at the NRCC, which is the House Republican arm for campaigning, do you buy it when he says, well, I thought that stock markets would go lower and gas prices would go higher, and I would have taken it because it's worth getting rid of Iran? His actions haven't told that story.
Yeah, I think we always hear that kind of bullishness from the president. I knew this was going to happen. In fact, he said, I thought gas prices were going to be worse. I think that's sort of the traditional bluster that we've come to know from the president. At the same time, obviously, it is true that they knew that this war was going to have an impact on gas prices, which is, I think, why you hear the president continuing to say this is a short-term thing. Prices will go up and then they'll go down lower than they've ever been before. That is the line that the president and the White House are still sticking to.
Yeah, and I think that is the line that Republicans themselves are clinging to from a political perspective. And I do think it's going to be interesting in the coming days. There is frustration that I don't think we've fully seen the breadth of spill out publicly from Republicans who are frustrated, for example, about the evacuation efforts that they feel were botched for Americans in the region. We are now hearing prominent chairmen from these committees that are relevant to Iran and ongoing foreign conflicts say they are concerned about the lack of information that the administration is giving them. So it's not just Democrats anymore who feel stonewalled. It is now trickling out to Republicans. And I just wonder if a supplemental or anything else is going to head to the Hill, what that actually ends up looking like among Republicans who have been allies of this White House. It's a lot for us to continue covering. White House reporter for Politico, Megan Messerly, thank you. You will continue to do it, and brilliantly, I would add. Still ahead for us, though, we're going to dig into the historic verdict against tech giants Meta and YouTube over social media addiction and what it could mean for those platforms and apps going forward. Plus, Today Show co-host Savannah Guthrie sits down for her first interview since her mother's disappearance, what she's saying about the ongoing case. We'll talk about those stories and more when we come right back.